Thank you very much, and thank you for the warm welcome, as well as recognizing that I am a sponsor, or I should say not only a sponsor, but an advocate for comprehensive immigration reform. It's not often I go anywhere and I'm congratulated for that, so I thank you. I thank you very much. It's been hard these days. But I'm not adverse to taking sometimes more difficult positions, I guess you can say. Thank you for inviting me to speak here at your 7th annual Latin American Conference focused on social investment and development in the Americas. Quite often we forget here in the United States we're part of the Americas, but I, for one, am one who does not forget so. My colleagues and I in Congress under the Democratic majority have been presented with a great opportunity to expand our friendship and influence in a region that, in my opinion, and I share this opinion with many of my colleagues, has been little assisted in the last decade for a myriad of reasons. But through trade and investment, we have a new opportunity for influence in a positive way in the Americas. The Democratic Caucus, for those of you who are familiar with Washington politics for the prior 6 years, was left out of all negotiations for trade agreements with Colombia, Peru, and Panama. But the strength of our majority was felt when President Bush realized he needed to negotiate a new trade agreement and a new trade agenda with Congressman Charles Rangel, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, which I have the honor to serve on with the chair of the Trade Subcommittee, Sandra Levin, and with the new Speaker of the House, Speaker Pelosi, to see that agreements that were previously entered into move forward. The new trade agenda was born out of a framework that will ensure our trade pacts with other nations respect laborers, both here and abroad, that respects the environment, both here and abroad, and that respects our nation's future economic success. Specifically, the Democratic majority achieved the long sought-after goal that our trade agreements will include enforceable labor and environmental standards. This new framework for establishing trade agreements illustrates how Democrats understand the benefits of free trade, but the need for it to be conducted on a fair and level playing field. The new trade policy achieves the core democratic principles and goes far beyond the provisions in any previous free trade agreement. All pending free trade agreements will be amended to incorporate key democratic priorities, and that's Democrat with a capital D, in case you were wondering, and will be fully enforceable. Key demands that were met are fundamental labor and environmental protections included in trade agreements that are fully enforceable. After years of opposition, the administration and Republicans in Congress agreed to include in the text of the agreement of the 5 ILO worker rights: the right to association, collective bargaining, prohibitions on child labor, prohibitions on slave labor, prohibitions on discrimination. For the first time, environmental standards cannot be lowered and will be fully enforceable in all free trade agreements. The agreed-upon framework expands access to life-saving medicines in the developing world. The trade agreements with Colombia and Panama, though, present additional and distinct obstacles that need to also be addressed. This framework is not a carte blanche for every trade agreement. The framework is about leveling the playing field for American workers, farmers, and businesses, and promoting a trade policy that advances U.S. economic interests around the globe. Democrats will continue to work across the aisle to make sure our country stays at the forefront of this globalized world. This bipartisan framework will keep America as a global economic leader and a champion for the principles that Americans believe in. When Speaker Pelosi stood before the press on May 10th of this year to announce the breakthrough agreement, Mr. President, how are you? She said that Democrats were not the party of protection, and they would not be the party of protectionism. Just a few weeks ago, we proved that, I believe, by passing the U.S.-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement, with close to a majority of the Democrats in our caucus supporting that act. This is an agreement that will benefit both our countries and has what I see as the honor of being the first of the 4 agreements that Congress can act on under the President's now expiring Trade Promotion Authority, or otherwise known as TPA. As a New Yorker, it's not hard for me to see the economic value all 3 of these agreements will have for my city and state, but problems still exist that are sometimes beyond our control. We still have 2 other agreements in our hemisphere, Colombia and Panama, which have problems that must be dealt with before Congress can bring these agreements to the floor for a straight up or down vote. Colombia still must deal with the issues of violence and impunity that exist in that society. During a recent visit to Colombia in October, I had the privilege of sitting down with President Uribe, an individual I have a high regard for, and asked him if it was fair to say that at one time impunity existed in Colombia. His response to me was, "Yes, Congressman." I then followed up and asked him, "Mr. President, does impunity still exist in Colombia?" His response was very honest and very telling. He said to me, "Congressman, impunity is no longer tolerated in my country," which was a very honest answer, I believe. This statement says a lot about a man who has worked to transform his country away from paramilitary death squads and narco-traffickers. We also discussed the economic and psychological impacts on Colombia if they were left behind Peru and potentially Panama. These are all things that Congress must take into account as we continue to move forward with our trade agenda. The agreement with Panama should have been the easiest, but they have for lack of a better, more artful term, a 600-pound gorilla who was elected by his peers to a very important position. I cannot imagine this agreement moving forward with this gentleman's colleagues until this gentleman's colleagues make a decision about his future and the future of Panama. That is not an issue, though, for Congress, that Congress should dictate. Instead, the Panamanians should deal with it as an internal matter. The passage of free trade agreements are not the only way to assist our neighbors, though. My friend and chairman of the Western Hemisphere, a subcommittee in the House, a Foreign Relations Committee, on which I also am a sitting member, Elliot Engel, introduced the Social Investment and Economic Development Act for the Americas of 2007, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of that legislation. After many years of neglect, I believe the legislation is the starting point for a less than stellar record for the United States in the hemisphere. We are finally waking up to the importance of the economic and social development in our neighborhood under Chairman Engel's leadership. Social justice for Latin Americans should be one of our country's top priorities. In 2005, almost 40% of the region's population, some 209 million people, were living in a state of poverty. And Latin America continues to have a higher level of income inequity than other regions in the world.